Yo, what's up, Mr. Cabot? How you doing?
Hey, good man. Good to see you.
Likewise. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another Modern Sales Power Hour. I'm Pete. We'll give everyone a little bit of time to join here. I'm super pumped today because we have a very, very illustrious sales leader, both who's a multi-threat, right? Sales leadership background, sales operations background, sales development background as well. So super pumped to have Mr. Mike Cabot here today. Mike, what's been shaking, man? Have you gone to any soccer games recently? I know you're a big soccer guy.
Yeah, not too recently. It's break time, but things pick up again in March. So
Nice.
excited to get going again. Yeah, yeah.
Who's
Just
your
been-
who's your is that American soccer break, or is that
yes.
also like Premier League soccer break as well?
No. This is American soccer. Yes, I'm a San Jose Earthquakes fan. Although I do watch some Premier League stuff as well.
Who's your
But
who's your
yeah.
Premier League who's your Premier League team?
Probably Tottenham, but not for a good reason. Like just I can find him on TV, and I like Harry Kane because he reminds me of Chris Wondolowski, who's on the Earthquakes, is the leading MLS goal scorer of all time. They're kind of similar sort of personalities on the field.
Nice. Got it.
Yeah,
Killer, man. Awesome.
yeah.
Cool. So while folks are kind of like getting trickling in here, we'd like to get everybody to kind of get familiar with Zoom. So the idea behind Modern Sales Power Hour is that it involves audience participation. So please do use the chat panel. You can kind of chat with your the other attendees. And you can leverage the Q&A panel to kind of like to ask questions here, because that's the big thing here is that what we're here to do is to answer your kind of most burning questions, because we have an illustrious sales leader here to kind of help answer those questions, and we have me as well, who will try to add value here and there. Yeah, go ahead and give us drop in the chat where you're kind of calling in from, where you're joining from, what you're most excited about learning today. So for folks who aren't familiar, Power Hour is hosted by MSP, Modern Sales Pros. So MSP is the world's largest revenue leadership community for those in sales management, sales and revenue operations, sales development, and the related supporting disciplines. The community's mission is really to create an environment for our 25,000 members to answer the questions that they struggle to solve on their own. And so the whole idea is here is to help revenue leadership and all the kind of the other personas that we work with see around corners and really just like make their professional lives way easier. And the way that we do that is through like great live sessions, kind of like this. We have a really robust online forum, and in the near future some in-person events, which we used to have all the time, and we're gonna have some more soon. So for those who weren't previously admitted, we'll go ahead and add you to the community. And if if you don't get access, don't hesitate to drop us a note to Modern Sales at modernsaleshq.com. And so before we get started here, just a couple of reminders. Power Hour is a really unique format insofar as there's not really like a specific piece of content that we're like talking through here. It's not like a webinar. Really what we're focused on here is picking the brain of our guests here. So in this case, Mike, who we'll talk a little bit about Mike here in a hot second, and why you should care about what he has to say about sales excellence and sales leadership, and myself as well. And so the whole idea here is that we want you to ask your questions, right? We want you to ask questions that are kind of bugging you at work, pissing you off, how to, whatever kind of thorny thing that you're trying to deal with on your AE team or SDR team or sales operations function, or what have you. And so the whole idea here is for folks to chat and interact with your peers, but also just, ask those questions, which is absolutely, required. So with that, what I'd love to do is like start with some introductions here. So I'll go first. I'm Pete Kazanjy. I'm the founder of Atrium. Atrium makes data-driven sales management software that helps sales managers, so AE, SDR, AM, CSM managers use data and metrics to improve team performance. Also the founder of Modern Sales Pros as well, and have about a decade of experience in sales leadership, before which I was a product manager and a product marketer. So been around the block a couple times. Also wrote a book on early stage sales called Founding Sales. Kind of like the missing manual for early stage startups and go to market. But I'm super pumped to have Mike here today. And so, Mike, do you want to give a little bit of an introduction for yourself, and maybe talk a little bit about your background, what you did at Moogsoft, what you did at Malwarebytes, the kind of the other sales leadership roles that you've had, and maybe describe a little bit the sales motions and the markets that you're currently selling into, and kind of the ones that you've sold into before.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, everybody. Excited to be here. And I love talking to Pete. We've been geeking out on sales stuff for a while, so this is super fun.
Sales Nerd Fest.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I've been doing sales pretty much my whole life. Even when I was a kid, everyone was always like, "Oh, you're going to be in sales someday." I've always been just trying to convince my teachers of getting out of homework, or convincing people to dig holes in the backyard for a trampoline I wanted, or whatever it was. But in terms of professional,
you're like Tom Sawyer, right? It's like Tom Sawyer. all these people are giving me apples in order to paint the fence that I need to do.
It works. Yeah. But yeah, so currently I'm at a company called Moogsoft. I'm heading up all revenue there, but it's we're selling into kind of across different segments. It's primarily focused on large enterprise, but we also have a lot of small enterprise customers as well. At Malwarebytes, I was running their corporate business as well as their online. So it was very interesting, because it was sort of thinking about how do you take a lot of digital sales experiences that don't necessarily need human involvement or need limited human involvement, all the way up to small enterprise accounts, and how do you make all that sort of work together. Before that, I was mainly banging around kind of really early stage startups, just trying to build out teams and evangelize. And I've always been fascinated by innovative technology, AI, and it was kind of an early AI company called Infer, which some of you may have heard of. And before that, when I was a rep, I was doing the big deal hunting stuff. So as Pete said, it's sort of interesting, right? I've kind of done like everything from big deal hunting all the way down to sort of mid-market, high velocity, down to online, and as well as running SDR teams. So I'm passionate about lead scoring and prospecting and all the rest. So yeah.
But you are really, it is like a super triple threat. It's hilarious, because like at I got introduced to Mike because he worked at this company called Merced Systems, which it's kind of like the grandpa of Atrium, right? So it was like one of the earliest kind of like data-driven management, more focused on support and like call centers and what have you. And so like you worked on SDR stuff there, and then also on sales operations there. And then at Infer, you guys sold to a lot of inbound organizations, a lot of so you were selling to SDR organizations, right? I mean, marketing organizations who eventually would obviously care about passing leads to SDRs and what have you. And then obviously Malwarebytes, I think it had a very, so Infer, no way was anybody just trying out Infer just for shits and giggles, right? The heavy implementation thing. And of course, Merced was insane, right? It's just in the era before APIs or whatever, you had to install into the PBX system, the phone system at the actual thing. And then, but then Malwarebytes, people would self-serve download the Malwarebytes anti-phishing agent and what have you. And so lots of different personas that you're selling into, and then and lots of different sales motions. Is Moogsoft's is Moogsoft kind of easy in like that, or is it more direct sales led, we're going to have a conversation and we're going to see about doing a pilot or something like that, or are people just turning on Moogsoft, just so folks can kind of have an understanding of what your current sales motion looks like?
I would say it's we're aspiring to have a situation where people can just turn it on. We have a free trial.
Sure.
But yes, today it's a little bit more oriented around conversation first, understanding sort of what problem are they going to solve. Similar to Infer, right? We had to figure out, what are you trying to score against? What kind of model do you want to build in order to give you the best model? You can do, technically speaking, it's not a technology problem. It's really a business problem that makes it not as self-serve as you'd like it to be.
Yeah.
It's focused on, we sit down, figure out kind of what are they looking to do, we're looking to observe in their environment.
Got it. Cool. Yeah. Excellent. Well, I have a set of questions that people submitted ahead of time here that we can kind of get into and kind of chop it up. But also, like as noted, folks, if for the folks who have joined us, looks like we're now got a goodly number of folks here. If you have a topic that you want us to opine on and kind of dig into, the whole idea here is that this is kind of like car talk. This is kind of like love line. If you got a problem, we'll do our best to kind of like put our heads against it. But otherwise, like we have a bunch of questions that were submitted ahead of time that we can get into as well. Actually, how big's the sales org at Moogsoft right now?
We've got about 15 people across the org. Yeah. Okay.
How many sellers?
There's about 6 sellers.
Half dozen.
Yeah. It kind of depends on who you consider sellers. You've got people doing upsell work and account management type stuff too. But yeah.
Yeah, so this is like super different than like Malwarebytes, where you had like a huge sales organization, right?
Yeah,
and I think one of the questions that was kind of like that was submitted earlier is like really focused on less that like smaller organization and more that like mid-scale organization where like you're a sales leader and you've got a layer of managers below you, especially because like oftentimes in these like higher growth startups, oftentimes those managers can be fairly junior, right? Yeah. So like they're recently promoted reps, or maybe their manager came in from somewhere else, but like usually we're still like not talking about like 40-something-year-old or like 50-something-year-old like line managers or whatever who've kind of like been around the block and done this. So like what are some of the things that you like to do in order to make sure that like those managers are set up for success? Like what are the processes you give them? What's like, what are the values you imbue them with? Like, just kind of talk about like providing leverage and kind of making sure those managers are like successful.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, well, first of all, I think, as managing managers, right, trying to figure out what are people good at. When I came into Malwarebytes, for example, there was a set of managers that all of them pretty much was their first time managing, not all of them, but for the most part. And so the first thing I was trying to figure out is like, okay, what things do you know how to do and what things do you not know how to do and how to, turn you into a killer. And I found that some people were good with people stuff, but they didn't understand sort of operations. And some people were, maybe good with operations, but didn't understand people, or they didn't understand, aspects of sort of planning and how to deal with hairy situations. So first was just sort of analyzing that.
Do like a skill assessment on them, like where are your gaps, where are your strengths?
Yeah. And then really work with them on those things. I mean, one person in particular who actually just hired over here at Moogsoft, was just an amazing personality and sort of, but like he knows this, but operationally he still struggled with some of like spreadsheeting and reporting and things like that, and he got killer at it, and then he was absolutely just off to the races from there.
It's kind of like the joke I like to say is like this is like one of my favorite fortune cookie phrases is the man or woman who knows their limitations has none. Right? Because like you avoid those limiting situations, or you work to remediate those limitations. So it sounds like first things first. Let's go ahead and like do a gap analysis and what have you, and then work to resolve it. What else?
I think the other thing is really thinking about what are they spending their time on? Are they? I think about the most important things are coaching and helping reps work through deals. So if they're spending a lot of time on things that are not related to that, it's sort of like how do we get that stuff off your plate. And I think even within that, and not to, say here and plug Atrium, but, Malwarebytes.
I don't have a problem with that.
But, one of the hard parts as a manager is figuring out where do you spend your time. And so you may, first of all, as a new manager, you may not even know how to figure that out. Do you even know how to get your hands on the data? But then even if you do, it can take a long time. And so we brought Atrium in as a way to sort of help managers figure out, okay, who do I need to spend time with and what should I spend time on? And I think that's a big thing in enabling managers by getting rid of those tasks that are just like, I found a lot of managers were sitting in meetings all day they didn't need to be in. I was like, those meetings are not with your team. Like, give me the operational stuff. Let's push it operations, and you guys can focus on really on your team and deals.
Yeah, for sure. Like one of the phrases, I'm like a broken record on this. One of the phrases that we kind of keep coming back to, and on the Atrium sales team, and go to market team, customer success as well, as calendar is destiny. Right. And so like what your calendar looks like is really what you're going to spend time on. And so that can mean a variety of things. Like one, do an analysis of like where you're spending your time and is that appropriate?
Yeah.
Kind of like what you're saying, like why are you in all these marketing meetings? WTF. Right.
Yeah.
And then the second thing can be like if you have an intention, like I need to get better at data-driven coaching, or I need to get better at deal strategy as a manager, or I'm a rep and like my pipeline is like a pig pen and I need to get on top of that. Cool. Like you can have that aspiration. But if you don't block time on your calendar, guess what? It's not going to happen, right?
Right. Right.
Like it's
Yeah.
like, and so like, putting that time on the calendar to say either A, removing the bullshit from the calendar, like you were talking about,
Yeah.
or B, putting things on the calendar from an intention standpoint, like, wonderful. This is
Yeah.
the hour and a half twice a week that I'm blocking for you, Mr. Pigpen rep, with like all the untouched opportunities. And then we're going to bird dog this untouched opportunities metric to make sure that you're actually adhering to that. But the
Right.
first step is to put it on the calendar. I think that
Yeah.
makes a ton of sense there. One of the things that I like to do, one of the things that I like to do with respect to kind of like junior managers, it's like managers in general too, and also staff, is like give them at least like a base layer of like how we run things,
Mm-hmm.
right? And because I think this is one of the things that like I think people get some really bad management advice. Or like probably the best example is like, oh yeah, you just hire smart people and get out of their way. It's like the worst possible thing. It's just like, no. Hire smart people, insert them into an operating rhythm and an existing system that like helps that like gives them that, and then let them iterate and innovate on top of that,
Mm-hmm.
and versus kind of just like throwing them like deep end, like into the deep end or whatever. And so I'm a big like operating rhythms and cadences guy, and so making sure that your manager is like, hey, look, so here's our operating rhythm
Yeah.
at this organization, and like some of that is related to like metrics and making sure that you understand like what's going on, and some of it's not, right? It's like, but here's our operating rhythm, and usually operating rhythms are like lined up around meetings, and it's kind of like, okay, we got our Monday morning sales team meeting, and like each sales team has that meeting, and this is the agenda associated with it. And then and then each manager is supposed to have like 30 minutes of like deal strategy per rep each week, right? To like, talk about 5 deals or 10 deals or whatever. And then we've got like a team forecast call where like we're inspecting close dates and whatever. And then we've got one-on-ones, which is not deal strategy. And that's more about like, how are you feeling, coaching, like, career development conversations. And then, quarterly, you should be thinking about having dinner with each of your reps individually, right? But like giving them that like operating rhythm such that they're like, oh, okay, cool, I get it. Here's the thing, and then they start having ideas on top of that, where they're just like, hey, I thought I would add this other kicker here, or like, you know what, this feature of the operating rhythm, I actually don't think the juice is worth the squeeze, so I'm going to propose that we deprecate this. Is that cool? Yeah, that is cool. Why don't you do that? But like, keep your eye out to make sure that doesn't negatively impact win rates or doesn't negatively impact blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
But like having an operating rhythm set up to begin with is like really impossible. Um, and yeah, so wonderful. So that's like all about like empowering managers, and I'm going to try to find this asset that we have around like operating rhythms so I can drop it into the chat. But I think we have this like really cool question from Pete Strackup here. I want to see here. Oh, unfortunately, it doesn't look like I can actually bring Pete on live. I wonder if that's a limitation of Zoom webinars here. But anyway, okay, we're gonna ask Peter Stracker's question here. So he has a question about like, so this is all about what modern selling. So what are the key differences between between selling now versus pre-pandemic? Kind of like reactions to that there, Mike.
Yeah. Well, I think that, well, I think you could even take that bigger and say, if you look at just kind of, for those of you who've been selling for a while, I mean, at least when I was coming up, things were very different. The role of a salesperson in a lot of ways was almost a pure relationship manager. I mean, I remember early in my career going to meetings that was sort of just observing and seeing the rep would open the meeting. They would, make the introductions, and then they would hand it off to a technical person, and they go sit in the back and play games on their phone. And I think that's been sort of, accelerated by this sort of COVID shift and work from home, and that it's just not, you can't do that anymore. There's no, I mean, you're not going to go and take them to play golf or out to dinner necessarily. So you have to show up with value. You have to really understand the product you're selling. I think that's a really thing I think it's a really important thing for all sellers. If you don't understand what it is you're selling, then you really don't understand how you're going to help somebody. And, selling is about helping people. And it's amazing. If you help people, they give you money. It's pretty straightforward. So,
weird.
Yeah, weird thing, right? Anyway, so I think that's changed. I think people are also I think they have less patience. We're all sitting on Zooms all day long. And so it's sort of like, just God, like when we're meeting, it's like, if it doesn't get right to it, I would say if your deck has a bunch of fluff in it, get rid of all that stuff. I think you want to get to the point, get to value, show them you understand, do the research, and get there quickly. And yeah, I think that's hopefully where things are heading. And I think that's where they've been headed for a while.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing there, it's just like less abstraction. Yeah, I think, yes, totally. It's like less abstraction in roles around, the relationship manager or the relationship guy or gal or what have you, versus the for the technical thing. I think so I think the kind of driver of that is there's a lot more simplicity around, or like a lot of product has been invested in to like make that simpler. But I think the other thing too is that the velocity has changed quite a bit. Because like imagine like the like three-legged race, or like the fancy like waltz kind of like foxtrot that has to happen where there's like an AE and then an SE and then there's a no. It's like, man, that's going to be like a deal cycle and a half. So they better be worth a ton of money. Which the problem, of course, with that is that if it's there's only so many organizations that can afford a ton of money, in which case now you're talking about like heavily constraining your TAM, right? And so by virtue of the fact that like one, virtual selling, thank you Zoom, thank you GoToMeeting, thank you WebEx, et cetera, makes it such that like we don't have, like we're reducing friction in terms of sellers going out and meeting with people and want to have like spending half of their day in the car, or like multiple days on a plane, or or what have you. Instead, they're just like back to back on Zooms, which is good because it drives more efficiency. But I think that speaks to the thing. It's like, cool, well, if you're going to be doing that, like you can't have a lot of like handoffs and what have you. And I think that like those two things happen. I think the big thing that I've seen over the last like 18 months or so with customers that of ours is these enterprise reps, and I think part of this is like changes on the buyer's side, where like the buyers got more comfortable around like dropping 100 G's just with like people that they've like zoomed it up with. Right. And whereas like previously that kind of felt like, oh, would you ever like, give $100,000 or 50K to someone you've never met before? And people would be like, I mean, I do a 10K deal or do a 25K deal virtually, but like, I don't know. And I think it was like one of those things where people were like, there's really no reason, right? But like we were just kind of in the mode. And I think what happened was like buyers all of a sudden, first half of 2020, they were like, oh man, I don't know how like bad this COVID thing is. And so like, they didn't want to talk to reps, right? Even if reps were like, like devil may care, let's go. Like the buyer's like, actually, how about you stay on the other side of that computer screen? And I think that like the buyers changed. And so what ended up happening is like the sellers changed as a result and like had a huge benefit, because this is one of the things that we oftentimes contend with. It's like less and less of an objection recently, like with like Atrium, is like Atrium, the whole idea behind Atrium is like, there's a set of KPIs that matter for every rep, regardless of like what organization they're in, right? So like, bookings matter, wins matter, customer facing meetings matter, op count matter, new ops, pipe, new pipe, forward facing pipe, all like there's like a couple dozen KPIs that matter. And so when we would talk with enterprise companies, they'd be like, oh yeah, you can't instrument enterprise reps. It's more of like a feel thing and like a finesse thing and blah, 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 blah. And like my reaction to that historically, because like I'm a cynical goofball, it's like, what are you talking about? There's like 40 hours in a week, right? Like everybody's got the same 40 or 50 hours in a week. If an enterprise rep is going to close $2 million a year, or like $1 million or $2 or $3 million a year, that still doesn't mean that they shouldn't be having like 10 or 15 or 20 customer facing meetings, maybe not 20, but like 15 customer facing meetings a week. Because like what else are they doing with their time? Like you like to pretend that you can't instrument any enterprise reps is like asinine. Their metric, their levels will look different, the same way that like the KPIs of like a center in basketball is different than the KPIs of like a point guard, but you still can measure them, right? Like they'll be touching fewer ops, but they better go deep AF in those ops and be like multi-threaded across 10 people, and then have like meetings with each of them. That still means that like, but you can still count those things, right? And I think what happened is as soon as the buyers were like, actually, let's meet virtually, the enterprise sellers like, okay, I guess we have to. They then notice that they can like slot in more stuff and like make more money and be more effective, right? And so I think that was like a pretty substantial change there, for sure. So one thing that so Nate actually has a really interesting question here on prospecting and kind of like sales cadences and sequences and prospecting, what have you. And so he says, hey, I see a ton of info about sales cadences for SDRs. What about AEs? How do you have your AEs build their follow-throughs after demo through close? So I think there's probably like two questions here. Maybe one is like, hey, how can like AEs potentially use sales engagement software to do cadences maybe around prospecting, which is not exactly what Nate's question is, but also like how can you formalize the follow-up execution after an initial meeting to provide more rigor to account executives. I would imagine this is something that was like probably pretty important for you at Malwarebytes, because like more velocity, a lot of parallel opportunities, what have you. What did you guys do to kind of help the AEs have more structure around that? Did you guys do any automation or kind of like guardrails like that, or is it like more like pipe review and stuff like that?
A little bit. I think that, first of all, I think that AEs should always be prospecting. If you're an AE, if you're managing AEs and your AEs say they're not going to prospect, it's just their SDRs, then you got a problem. All the best salespeople I know, they prospect all the time. Like, doesn't matter. Even good enterprise reps, they anyway, so I just want to say that. And those tools are great. You can still use them. Even if you don't fully build out all the cadences, still use it for tracking purposes. There's all kinds of goodness in using those tools. I think, in terms of sort of the post initial call, a lot of it was really guardrails around process, which was tied to stage movement, right? So sure, dates around stages and then really outlining that as a playbook. We didn't necessarily leverage those tools in that context where we said like, this is the standard sort of follow-up email that's going to get sent after every first meeting, but it's certainly something you could do. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's actually a good idea. I hadn't thought about that. So yeah, it's a good idea.
Yeah, for sure. I think that SalesLoft is a longtime customer of Atrium's, and it's like, it's unsurprising that like they're very advanced and like using like eating their own ice cream and using SalesLoft for SalesLoft, especially because like with these sales engagement tools, they needed to like, SDR is great, and like as the SDR abstraction of like having people focus that more heavily focused purely on prospecting, that's not going away. And but obviously, if you're in a sales engagement platform like SalesLoft or Outreach, like your total addressable market being limited by organizations that adopt the new technology of SDRs, which itself is only like maybe at 10 years old, maybe like 15 years old, you're gonna like erroneously limit your TAM there. So what they started to do is think about like, okay, how can you AEs use these AEs, AMs, CSMs use these guardrails or like swim lanes or whatever your appropriate metaphor is to help to help them have better execution. And like sales, I remember, gosh, it was, I think it was Sean Fowler who was kind of taking me through a lot of this. You can like, because you can do all sorts of crazy stuff, right? So there's like, there's a post, SalesLoft has like a post, post first demo, they call it a cadence, and it's not like a bunch of automations and emails. It's like, here's this follow-up template. It's a manual template, but then there's also like guardrails in there tied to the op where it's like, hey, has this progressed? Like, where are we at? Right. And it doesn't have to be email based. It's like a task. And I think like organizations used to do these sort of things around like instantiating tasks in on like the opportunity object or whatever in Salesforce or whatever your CRM is, and then like use the console. Like I know this is like a big thing at LinkedIn was to use the Salesforce console view in order to be like, hey, where are my tasks at? But oftentimes like relying on your reps to instantiate those tasks themselves is like, good luck, right? But you don't, and so like providing them those tasks. A couple of ways that like what we do on our team or what we've seen in the market where folks doing this is like, yeah, using sales engagement software can be helpful for like where you can like declare a process with some kind of back checks. Obviously, what Mike talked about around like having good exit criteria and good like stage crispness can be really good. The problem is that oftentimes, your sales motion has way more like steps in it than you want to have stages. Like you don't have like a 10-stage opportunity. It's like kind of weird, but there are a lot. And so you don't want to kind of get like lost in those. And so one of the things that I've been seeing a lot recently with, we're doing this, and also I've seen a number of other customers is like using more modern mutual account planning, like close plan software, or like mutual account planning software. So just so you have like those steps broken out, and it's kind of like an initial playbook, right, with like almost like templated. And I guess you could do with like SalesLoft. I'm sorry, not SalesLoft, with like Asana if you wanted to, or something like that, or Trello. But in these cases, these are like Salesforce attached, like CRM attached. And so what you can have is you can have like, cool, these are the things that normally get done in each of these stages. And if like you don't need to do it in this op, well then okay, you can delete it, right? Or if there's like a weird ancillary thing that needs to happen that's not like normally in the playbook, well now you can create that task in there. Maybe it's internal facing just for you, or maybe it's a shared task for you and the prospect. And like reps really like that, right? Because it gives them the it gives them those guardrails and it gives them the swim lane, and then they can like pop in there and be like, oh yeah, what was the next thing right there. And then the added benefit of it is that it can be external facing to the prospects as well, so there's like mutual accountability. So that's something that I know that folks I'm seeing more and more that folks are doing. I think in terms of just like using sales engagement platform software for reps for kind of other use cases, one of the things that like I think is like wildly under leveraged is like using automations for like scaled touches across your pipe. Like it's funny, like because people will do like, they're like, oh, I gotta like put a bunch of touches on my pipe. Like if you can use a little bit of like automation thinking, like tied with content, what you can do is you can say, hey, here are the 20 ops that are open to my pipe, or the 40 ops or the 60 ops that are open to my pipe. I know, right, like who the stakeholders are that I want to like put a touch on or whatever, and just like doing a loop across your pipe, even if it's like a mass mail where you're like delivering a piece of content or something like that, can be really powerful. And that's something that you can do with like automation software like SalesLoft or Mixmax or Apollo or Outreach or fill in the blank. So I think that those are kind of like areas where AEs can be more successful and kind of like using that leverage. Actually, so one thing that another kind of question that got dropped in here, Mike, was about repeatability in your sales process. So, how do you think, and maybe this is actually something that might be pertinent to Moogsoft, given kind of like the small size of the sales organization, how do you build repeatability into your sales process if you're, super early and there's not a lot of like data and kind of like sample size yet? Like you have 6 sellers, so like, that's a good amount of like sample size, but it's still not like 30. So
Yeah.
like, how do you look to do like where do you look for signal and like seek repeatability when you have small sample sizes?
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, it's very relevant. Yeah, coming from Malwarebytes where we had, I had a team of 100 people, it was
Oh
just
man,
the volume
amazing.
it was like a playground of data to work with.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah. Um, I think that the key is really thinking about, look, find anything that is happening, more than once. And if you can find any sort of repeatability, break down the process and start there, right? So if you've got repeatability around the types of people that are responding to your prospecting, okay, that's a start,
Sure.
right? If
Double
you're
down.
finding there's repeatability around certain industries and cycles that seem to be going fast. I mean, look for any that metadata that's surrounding what you're doing, whether that's, attributes of your customers or attributes of the deals, and finding any sense of commonality and happening, and then start there and just keep adding to it over time. And over
Right.
time, you'll be able to have a kind of a process that across from soup to nuts that is repeatable. But look for the gems. Start somewhere.
Yeah, it's like use your spidey sense to kind of like sniff that out, where it's almost like anecdata, where it's like, oh, I feel that I've seen this before. I feel that I've seen this before, right? And then see if you can like, and then the kicker I might kind of add to that is, and I see like one of the things that I'm really stoked about right now is that at Atrium we have 9 sellers. We used to have 5. So we're now like entering this stage where Atrium like really sings for organizations, because we've got like 10 AEs, and I think we have like 6 SDRs or whatever. And like, Atrium was really helpful for me over the last 10 years building our sales motion when I had like 2 AEs or 4 AEs or whatever. And so what would happen is, it's like there would be like a spidey sense thing, right? You'd be like, oh, I'm like seeing this thing. And then what you want to do, because oftentimes like it's very challenging to go like looking in the data for like patterns, because it's like, what am I looking for? So sometimes those patterns will show up through happenstance. But then what you want to do is you want to validate it. Be like, cool, is that just like availability bias, or is that like just lucky? Like, oh my God, like heads came up twice. This quarter is magic. It only has heads up. It's like, I don't know about that, Turbo, right? And so what I think what can be really helpful there is like, one, when you see like those kind of inklings, you can then jump into your data, even if it's like limited, in order to see if like it bears out, right? Like I'll give you an example of this. One of our 8, like back when we only had like 4 sellers, one of my top performers was, he was outperforming the rest of the team by like 30% of bookings. It was pretty substantial. And so I was doing a QBR and I was like looking through the deltas, and like, all my A's are fantastic, but this one, what was funny was like this one AE, like he didn't have the level of like product comprehension as the other AEs, but it didn't seem to matter. And so when we were digging into what was going on, so one of the things that's cool about Atrium is it takes about 90 seconds to set up. Right, we call it a data light. And so what our AEs are super focused on is like, hey, like they do disco, they figure out what your pain points are. Like, oh, wonderful, like Atrium can help you with like instrumenting the ramp of those reps. Or, oh, you have a pipe hygiene problem? Wonderful, we can figure out who has the most untouched ops and whatever. And so what we do is like the AEs are like focused on driving to a data, or at least now they are, because what had happened was this rep had figured out that like that's all that kind of mattered. And so he was very, very aggressive in like proposing that and being like assumptive around it. Be like, hey, that sounds great. You should share your screen and we'll get that set up for you right now. And so what ended up happening was, when I went and I looked in his data, I'm like, man, something's going on here. You could see that he was progressing. We have this stage, the stage 3, where like data has been turned on. And so even though he was getting the same number of ops as everybody else, because our guys are round robin, he was getting way more of them up to light up data. And then the funny thing was is that his win rate from stage 3 was actually the same as everybody else's. In fact, it was actually a little bit lower. But he was just giving himself so many more looks, right? So many more shots on goal. And so like, it was one of those things where like, and it didn't take me long to figure this out. It was just kind of one of those things like, oh, I feel like something's going on here. And I was able to pop into the data and kind of like pivot around a little bit and be like, oh man, that's the situation right there. Right. And so then what we did was we standardized that across the team. We're like, hey man, everybody's got to give themselves lots of shots on goals. In fact, we're going to set a goal on it. right? We're going to say, hey, you should have this many, like we used this, we had a goal on how many new ops were coming in a pipe just to make sure that everybody's being round robin sufficiently. And then we said, but you have this many that come in. This is how many should actually get to data live. And then we put a spiff on it. And by the way, if you get the data light up, like, first of all, guys, there's like a 40% win rate off of that. So like, it's in your best interest to do that. Also, I'll give you $100, right? And so then we standardized on that. And so what happened there was that even though it was like low sample size, we only had 4 reps at the time, he kind of like smelled something was going on. And then like kind of sussed it out. And we're like, okay, yeah, you know what? Something is going on here. And then like changed our selling behavior as appropriate, and then continue to measure that. And then like, lo and behold, the other reps, like they started getting more looks because they were being more aggressive like that. And lo and behold, everybody's bookings was at that same level, right? So like that sort of process there, even when you have small data, can be really, really powerful there. So actually kind of related to that, we just talked about like standardizing on a top performing rep. Like when you have a rep who's struggling, like how do you approach that, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one, especially for new managers trying to figure out, like, I know so-and-so is having a hard time. And I think that the way that I think about this stuff, just like you were sort of talking about this, is sort of like it's almost like a factory, right? It goes through certain processes. And so the first thing I'm trying to figure out is, okay, are they closing deals or not? And if someone's not closing deals, then, to your point, actually this ties right what you were saying, then try to figure out sort of where, what's going on. Do they have pipeline? I mean, if they have pipeline, then I'm trying to figure out sort of where is it dropping off? Are they struggling with late stage? Is it on the front end? Is it mid? And trying to figure out sort of, okay, where are they struggling? And then you can kind of attack that. Now, if they don't have a lot of pipeline, then you have to start to look at, okay, well, what's going on? And assuming that they're also prospecting for their own deals, then it's understanding, do you have the activities, and where are you spending your time on doing that? Do you have, you targeting the right people? How are you actually driving your pipeline? And if there's no activities, then it's sort of like, okay, maybe you're not right for this job. But I think it's really just breaking down the process in the same way you're sort of describing, looking for repeatability. Start where you want it, which is you want people closing deals and making money. And just keep moving down the line to figure out where it's broken, and then try to rub that point down and keep going from there.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny. I call what you're describing right there, like metrics inspection and diagnosis. And so there's like, it's like the upstream tree, right? Like what are the drivers there? I actually just dropped a link in the chat here around what those metrics trees look like. And here, actually, let me just go ahead and I'll bring this up right here, and I can share my screen. There's Mike. Cool. Yeah. So this is kind of like what this is like the way that we kind of think about this is like there's a set of drivers, like KPI drivers, that are upstream from outcomes. So in the case of AEs, you've got bookings, right? Okay, where do bookings come from? Well, they come from wins crossed with average selling price crossed with deal cycle. Okay, so which of these is problematic for this rep? Oh, his ASP is low. Okay, where does ASP come from? Well, ASP comes from a lot of places, right? It could be like your average op size mix. It could come from your win rate on different op tiers, right? Like you could be really problematic at, like, your win rate could be problematic at at larger reps. Or alternatively, that same rep or a different rep, they actually might have a wins deficit. Where's that coming from? Are they getting enough at bats? Right? Oh, they're getting plenty of looks. Their win rate just is bad. Oh, okay. Why is their win rate bad? Is it because there could be a variety of reasons, but where are the opportunities falling out of the pipe? Right? Is it because they have a pipeline hygiene problem, et cetera? And so what you can kind of do is do this variable isolation. It's kind of like applied scientific method, like, oh, okay, where's the issue? And then kind of go upstream and go upstream and go upstream, right? And then, figure out what that root cause is there. And you can do the same thing in SDR land as well, where it's like, hey, ultimately what we care about is pipe generation. I mean, ultimately what we care about is bookings sourced, right? But like, let's say that like pipe gen is like the big thing there. And then of course, then it's kind of question is like, okay, are the ops being accepted? Are they being, are they being submitted? That's kind of a cross between acceptance rates and ops submissions. And so then a question is like, oh, okay, well, how many ops are being submitted? And that's just a question of like quantity versus quality of prospecting activity and kind of quality of the opportunities that are being submitted there. And so a good thing that you can do is kind of going upstream there. And then I think that the big thing is like, it's one thing to just like be able to say, oh, here's this problem, right? The, the big problem though is that you then actually have to like solve it, right? Like actually change their behavior. And I think that's like where like coaching conversations really come in, and like making sure that you're having those conversations saying, hey, I'm seeing this right here, right? Let's talk about that. Actually, I just dropped a link in the chat around a document that we have around how to make coaching conversations easy. And actually, one of my favorite books on that, I just keep it next to me, is 5 Secrets of the Sales Coach by Corey Bray and Hillman Sori, where it's just like, hey, you should always have like a coaching thing that you're working on, right? It shouldn't be, oh, this person is like having a performance issue, and as a result, we're gonna have like a pip, or we're gonna have a coaching conversation there. It's like for each, what it is? It's the same as your sales manager thing earlier, where it's like, hey, we know where your deficits are, and then we're gonna set an intention to have a specific, like a thing that we're working on together. And that might be taking a top performer even higher, right? Or alternatively, it's somebody who's like, kind of like down in the dumps or has a development area. So like if you identify the development area, but then don't work to fix it, it's not super helpful in that regard.
One thing I just want to add to what you were saying too, I think one of the, again, not to further plug Atrium here because I see some of the comments which are funny, but one of the cool things that's really helpful about a tool like Atrium is that you want to understand also how people compare, because it's real sometimes you look at something, you're like, is this good or bad? I don't know. Well, understanding how people are doing against their peers is a good place to start. And I think the other thing that you touched on, which I think is a really important point, which is that it's about percentages, like conversion rates, win rates, but it's also about absolutes, because if someone only has, 4 deals and, they converted all 4 of them, but then someone had 50 deals. I mean, you have to look at both. If you can't just purely look at rates or purely look at absolutes. You've got to understand.
You got to do both. Yeah. The phrase that we use for that is like quantity, like sales success derives from a high quantity of high quality selling behavior, selling activity. And the funny thing is that like, I think that it's like, there's like some pretty like unfortunate misconceptions. I think they're working their way out of the market right now, where people are like, oh, well, you can't measure quality. It's like listening to calls or whatever. And it's like, that's actually not true. You can numerically measure quality. They're just different metrics. They're like ratios, right? And usually they're ratios, right? And then you see this, of course, in sports, right? Where it's like, oh, well, the quality of a hitter is like not like is their batting average, right? Like, and then moreover, it's their slugging percentage, right? It's like, do they hit consistently, and do they hit with power consistently? Same with, but if they only get 1 at bat a game, they could have like they could bat 500 or whatever, but if for whatever reason they injure themselves and they can't like bat in the 3rd inning, like that's not really super helpful. And so you kind of need both. And so this is like, as sales leaders, what we're seeking to do is like always like raise the quantity and quality of selling behavior that our teams can execute. And then once you're capped out on quantity, and there are like quantity limitations, right? Like it turns out that you can't, like having more than 20 meetings in a week is like kind of insane, right? Like it's like reps will be exhausted, they'll just like be going through the motions, etc. And so like once you're capped out in terms of like how many customer facing meetings an AE can be doing, well, now you have to like get into other things, like what's the conversion rates looking like, what's the win rate, can we raise our AS, can we get like more revenue intensive? Most organizations are usually not there from like a total quantity standpoint. So then it's kind of a question like, okay, well, how can we, how can we raise that up, et cetera. But like, yes, instrumenting both quantity and quality ends up like being a really, really important, important thing there. And so there's another interesting question here around, yeah, like efficiencies and what have you, which is like kind of related to what we were talking about. Which is like if you've got a low ASP product, which I think like Malwarebytes, at least in the lower segments, was like, a lower ASP. What are some ways that you can kind of like lower the cost of sales, like raise efficiencies, et cetera, in order to like ameliorate that and kind of like make that more successful?
For sure, yeah. It was interesting at Malwarebytes, right? At our low end, when I first got there, we had humans sort of doing full cycle management on $500 ASP segment, and
Oh, wow.
it's just not it's not sustainable, right? It's too expensive.
Yeah.
So first we're like, okay, well, let's just remove the humans. We'll just make it all digital. Well, it turns out that even if you're a small business and you want to buy, you need to talk to people.
Wrecks your performance. Yeah, wrecks your
Yeah.
conversion.
So really it was about figuring out what parts of that can we digitize, and then on top of that, providing buyers with opportunities to engage when they need it. So thinking about, we called it like just in time, sort of human involvement, like you have supply chain to just in time. It was like, look, when you need a human, we'll get a human in there, and if that means jumping into a chat or getting on a call, but otherwise, it's really trying to use technology to automate as much of it as you can so that you don't get stuck. But also, you shouldn't have to walk away from that revenue either, because people want to buy. It's great to take their money.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's I wrote this article for my buddy Lenny's newsletter on like layering sales onto a self-serve product. It may not be 100% as applicable. It's not the same thing like where we have low ASP, but there's some ideas in there around how you can, yeah, like bring sales into situations where it can be most high impact, right? And I think what you were kind of like figuring out there is, I mean, I talk about this all the time. One of my favorite books is The Goal. It's a process engineering book. And so if you're thinking about, the sales organization as an assembly line here, if we can figure out, like, we don't necessarily have to automate the entire assembly line, but maybe we can figure out like the certain areas where we can automate things. And like SDR to AE abstraction is a good example that it's not actual automation. It's just that the SDRs are cheaper, right? And we can have them work on maybe the part that they can work on that doesn't require the level of like skill or training that an AE would have. But then there's parts that you can automate as well, right? Like that's just like labor arbitrage. And in the SDR AE abstraction situation, then there's the opportunity to automate things, or like even automate, like get more leverage for your SDRs. Like, oh, why are the SDRs hunting and pecking through Zoom info or whatever? Can we have like an offshore team do that for like $2 an hour and kind of like, sniff those out? And so instead of having our like $30 an hour SDRs working on that, we can have that part of their work done for $2 an hour. And then that's handed over as Google Sheets or what have you. Yeah, can we create more leverage on the AE team? I mean, one of the ways that we've done this is like, so our sales motion is kind of fun. Like we're kind of like data doggy in this regard, insofar as, because Atrium takes about like 90 seconds to set up, we enter organizations through like a sales manager, an SDR manager, a sales operations person. It's like very much not a top-down sell where like show up to the CRO or what have you. And then like very frequently they'll just turn on an Atrium account for themselves because they just sign in like with their CRM credentials. And so what we seek to do is we want to be able to transact small with that person who has that pain point, because that's one of the secrets to like quick sales velocities is if you can transact with the person who has the pain point, then you're in a good spot. Because if you have to transact with someone who's not the person who has the pain point, that person now has to like engage in like empathy for the person who has the pain point, which is oftentimes very challenging, right? I mean, that's what we do as sellers, right? Is like we like invoke, like not only do we transfer enthusiasm, we like invoke empathy on the part of somebody else for this person, or reveal it like through good discovery, like, oh, you should have empathy for yourself and realize that like the pain that you're feeling right now is not okay, and you should be able to solve it, right? But if you can get yourself to a point where like the person can realize that they have pain, they can realize that they're unhappy about it, they can believe in the solution, and then they can actually transact on it. Well, now you're like, that's a recipe for like velocity. And you see that with like the self-serve stuff, like the Slacks or the Zooms or like Notion of the world. We're like, yeah, turns out like Confluence is a crappy wiki. I'm going to start using Notion, and someone just like starts using it. So if you can do that with your solution, like you're in a good spot. And so the way, but it becomes a little bit harder when you have like a more complicated solution. So like it's one thing to be Notion or Zoom or whatever. It's another thing, like in our case, where you're sales analytics. And so one of the things that we've done there is like when an organization turns on their data, like we turn around in like 72 hours and have another meeting to like walk them through their data and kind of say like, tie to the pain points that were elicited. AEs used to do that account setup. They would like go in there, they tune it up a little bit, et cetera. And then what we realized was like, it was related to us figuring out that we wanted to like light up data as much as possible. Well, what was happening was the AEs were like lighting up data and like putting it on their own plate over here. So they would like go all day long and be like, all right, cool. I did. Oh man, look at this pile of homework I made for myself, right? And so what we did was we staffed this like kind of baby solutions consulting role, because it's not like full bore like sales engineering or whatever. It's just like a little bit of tuning up. It takes about like an hour or two, whatever. It's just following a checklist. And so we have this team, we call it like go-to-market operations, that like just they work on that, right? So like an AE can like light up an account, they like submit an Asana form around like what's going on. They like log all the use cases, et cetera, et cetera. It fires over to these group of like, 24-year-olds, 26-year-olds or whatever, who are like super bright, and they're going to like go other places in our organization. Those guys like jam it out, et cetera. They like cycle it back to the AE. The AE's like stoked. 72 hours later, they're talking to and so what you've got there is a situation where like, again, like a $30 an hour or like a $40 an hour person is working on this. So like the AEs can just be spending their time. Like this is what, when I talk to AE candidates, like, oh, what does a normal day look like? I'm like, you're doing disco calls, you're doing product reviews, and you're doing closing calls. That's it.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, we're not working on other stuff. Like I do a lot of prospecting in my current role. And it's like, honestly, like God bless if you want to do prospecting. My goal is to make sure that you have no time for that.
That's the best. That's the best.
Yeah, if you can get it there, right? Like
Yeah.
not everyone can, right? But if you can get it there, because like now you're like that part of the assembly line is like fully levered and like working on the highest and best use of their time, right? Kind of like so like Rippling, Parker Conrad's company that is kind of like child of Zenefits. Each SDR at that organization has like an offshore SDR counterpart in like India, and they like I'm not 100% sure like how they pair or whatever, but it's like essentially like force multiplication. So each SDR is like overclocked with like an offshore helper, right? Who I don't think just like does like lead development. Like oftentimes people say like a lead development rep, like doing kind of like lead identification. I think they're actually like doing some sequencing and stuff. And but like it's a really interesting thing, because like you've got this SDR who's then levered up with like another person. So it's pretty rad.
Cool.
Yeah, I know all these things kind of like make you think, right? And like all of this, of course, is just like the like we're just continuous improvement, and what we're looking for is like areas where we can like lever things up, reduce friction, take steps out, et cetera, which I think is like kind of the crux of modern selling. Well, Mike, I think that I think we're kind of out of time here. This was like super rad. I really appreciate you taking the time. Obviously, tons of fun to talk about all the sales nerd stuff. Folks, go ahead and join us next week. Next week, we've got another really amazing sales thinker in the form of Jeremy Donovan. So he's the head of revenue strategy at Sales Loft. He's absolutely fantastic. Here's the link I just dropped in the chat. another absolutely fantastic sales strategy and sales operations thinker. He's going to be super fantastic. But all the resources that we've grabbed here, we've been dropping in the chat room, we'll go ahead and bring them back to everybody and kind of prior Power Hour attendees. Mike, this is super fantastic. Thanks for the time, and have a great weekend, okay?
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Pete.
Okay, see you, man.
Cheers.